And thank you. A first alert, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, letting President Donald Trump move forward with his plan to tighten mail-in voting rules. However, it's not clear how much can change before the midterm elections. Justices are allowing work to continue on the president's executive order, which directs the federal government to draw up lists of eligible voters and tells the Postal Service to deliver ballots only to people on those lists. Democratic officials from 23 states, including Wisconsin and Washington, D.C., sued and won a lower court block, but the Justice Department asked the High Court to let implementation begin with elections just weeks away. The ruling still leaves room for some new legal challenges, and with some states about to mail out those ballots, there may not be enough time to fully enforce the order before voters cast their midterm votes.